Jack woke up early, like he always did, long before the sun fully rose. The streets were quiet, and the town was still wrapped in a peaceful silence. The air was cool, a bit chilly for a spring morning, but Jack didn't mind. He had work to do, and it had become second nature to him over the years. He worked as a garbage man, driving his truck down every street, picking up trash from the bins left outside homes. Today felt like any other day. As he drove down the residential streets, Jack hummed along to the radio, the familiar rhythm of the job comforting him. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. The turn at Oak Street, the small alley behind Elm, and the big blue house on Pine Lane that always had the most trash. It was routine. Jack had been doing this job for a long time, and while it wasn't glamorous, it paid the bills. He loved the quiet mornings before the world really started moving. The only sounds were the hum of his truck and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. But today, something was different. As Jack drove past one of the houses, he heard it, a soft, faint noise that he couldn't quite place. At first, he thought it was the wind or maybe a dog barking in the distance, but the sound didn't go away. It grew louder, almost like a whimper. It wasn't a noise he expected to hear on his route, especially this early in the morning. Jack's eyes narrowed, and he slowed the truck, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. He listened carefully, and then it came again. A soft cry, like someone in pain or distress. Jack stopped the truck in the middle of the street. His heart began to race. There wasn't anyone else around, and the street was still empty, except for the sound. It was coming from the back of the house, near the alley where the garbage cans were kept. He had no idea who lived there, but something told him that this wasn't a normal situation. Jack sat in the truck for a moment, unsure of what to do. The cry came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was a woman's cry, filled with fear and desperation. His stomach twisted. What was happening? Was someone in trouble? Was there a fire? Or maybe an animal trapped somewhere? Without thinking too much, Jack turned off the engine and climbed out of the truck. The sound of the woman's cry echoed in his ears as he walked around to the back of the house. It was still dark, but there was enough light now to see. Jack's heart beat faster, and he instinctively moved toward the alley, his footsteps quickening. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he couldn't ignore it. Someone was in trouble. The question was, who and what had happened? The closer he got, the more urgent the cries became. Whatever was happening, it was serious. Jack's mind raced as he approached the alley, his breath coming a little faster. He was about to find out what was going on. Jack's heart was pounding as he moved closer to the alley, the sound of the crying growing louder with every step. His breath was shallow, and his eyes darted around, scanning the dark space for any sign of what was causing the noise. The alley was narrow, tucked between two houses, and the shadows made it hard to see clearly. But there was no mistaking it. The sound was coming from the back of the property where the trash cans were kept. The closer Jack got, the more desperate the crying sounded. It was no longer just a soft whimper. It was a continuous sob, like someone in deep pain, someone who couldn't stop crying. Jack's stomach tightened with worry. What was going on? Who could be in distress this early in the morning? The whole street had been quiet just minutes ago. As he walked past the neatly stacked garbage bins, Jack's mind raced. Maybe it was a dog trapped under something, or perhaps someone had accidentally fallen and was calling for help. But the cry sounded human, and that made his instincts scream at him to hurry. Whoever it was needed help. Jack quickly glanced around, looking for the source of the sound. The alley was still dark, and all he could make out were the usual bins of household waste. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then he heard it again, closer this time. The voice was weak, filled with sorrow, almost as if it was coming from within the wall of the house itself. Jack's breath caught in his throat, his legs carrying him faster now, despite the fear building in his chest. He reached the back of the house and stopped. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The noise had stopped for a brief moment, and Jack couldn't tell if that meant things had calmed down or if something worse was about to happen. But then a sudden sound made Jack freeze. The trash compactor, there it was, the heavy machinery used for compressing waste, was humming quietly. The noise was faint but distinct. It was running. And that was strange. The trash compactor was often used for collecting and crushing waste, but it had never been heard running so early in the morning. Jack's mind quickly pieced things together. Was someone trapped inside the compactor? His pulse quickened, and he immediately moved toward the machine. The cries had stopped for a moment, but Jack's concern only grew. If someone was in there, every second mattered. As he reached the compactor, Jack noticed something that made his skin crawl. There on the ground near the machine was an old faded blanket. It wasn't part of the usual trash. It looked out of place. Jack bent down to inspect it more closely, his hands trembling. What could this mean? Who would leave a blanket like this, and why was it so close to the compactor? Just as he straightened up, he heard the cry again, louder now, almost a plea for help. The sound came from the compactor. Jack's stomach twisted in knots, and without thinking, he moved forward, determined to find out what was happening. The weight of the moment hit him, and all he could think about was getting to the bottom of the mystery. What was going on here, and who needed help so desperately? Jack's mind raced as he approached the machine. He knew this was no ordinary morning. Whatever had happened, he was about to find out. Jack stood in front of the trash compactor, his heart racing. The quiet hum of the machine was now mixed with the faint sound of sobbing coming from inside. It wasn't a sound that should be coming from the compactor. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. What was going on? He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. His mind raced. Could someone really be trapped inside the compactor? The idea felt impossible, but the sound was unmistakable. Jack had been doing this job for years, and he'd never encountered anything like this before. There were no signs of trouble, just the regular trash bins, and the compactor was running, which didn't make sense so early in the morning. Without wasting another second, Jack pulled open the metal door of the compactor. The noise of the machine immediately grew louder as the door creaked open, revealing a pile of trash inside. It was mostly bags, some filled with food waste, others with newspapers and old cardboard. But beneath the trash, something caught his eye. A hand. A human hand, weakly reaching out from the pile. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he froze for a moment. The hand was barely visible, but it was there, and it was moving, trembling slightly as if it were trying to reach for something. That was when Jack realized the truth. There was someone inside the compactor, someone who had been crushed by the trash, and who had been trying to survive. His hand shook as he quickly scanned the area for anything to help. He had to act fast. He couldn't waste another second. The cries had stopped for a moment, but the hand was still there, its fingers twitching weakly. Jack knew that every minute could mean the difference between life and death. Without thinking, Jack reached in, carefully lifting the trash away from the person trapped inside. It was a delicate task. He had to avoid disturbing the machine, making sure nothing else shifted that could cause more harm. As he cleared away the trash, he saw the rest of the body. A woman, her face pale and covered in dirt, her body bruised and battered. Jack's mind raced, and panic started to set in. How had she ended up here? What was going on? He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. This woman needed help, and fast. He pulled her out as gently as possible, being careful not to hurt her more in the process. Her body felt fragile in his arms. He quickly checked for any signs of life. Her chest was rising and falling slowly, but she was unconscious, her breathing shallow. It was a relief to know she was still alive, but Jack couldn't shake the thought of how close she had come to being crushed by the compactor. He quickly laid her on the ground next to the compactor, his hands still trembling. He had to call for help. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling as he dialed 911. His voice was shaky as he spoke, but he tried to stay calm. "I need help. There's a woman here. She's been trapped in the trash compactor. Please hurry." As he waited for the emergency services to arrive, Jack stayed by her side, doing his best to comfort her, even though she was unconscious. He couldn't stop thinking about how this could have been prevented. How anyone, could have done this to her. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that help would come in time. Jack's hands trembled as he stayed by the woman's side, waiting for help to arrive. Every second felt like an eternity. He kept glancing at her, hoping to see her wake up, to see any sign that she was going to be okay. But she remained unconscious, her shallow breaths the only sign that she was still alive. The sun had fully risen by now, and the streets around them were coming to life, but it felt like time had stopped in this small alley. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of birds. Jack kept his eyes on the woman, trying to make sense of the situation. What had happened to her? How did she end up in the trash compactor? And why? Just then, he heard the familiar sound of sirens in the distance. Jack let out a sigh of relief. They were close. He quickly stood up and waved his arms, signaling to the emergency responders who were arriving. The ambulance pulled up, followed closely by a police car. Jack stepped aside to let the medical team through, his heart still racing. The paramedics quickly got to work, checking the woman's vitals and carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. They worked swiftly, their movements practiced and efficient. Jack couldn't help but watch, his thoughts still swirling with questions. One of the paramedics looked up at Jack and gave him a quick nod of acknowledgement before they loaded the woman into the ambulance. "Who is she?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did she end up in the compactor?" The paramedic paused for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know. We'll figure that out later. What matters now is that she's alive. Thanks to you, she's got a chance." Jack nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. Yes, she was alive, but how had she ended up in such a terrible situation? He watched as the ambulance sped off, disappearing around the corner, and then turned his attention back to the scene. The police had begun to inspect the area. They were taking notes, snapping photos, and carefully examining the trash compactor. Jack could see the officer who was in charge approach him, a serious look on his face. "Do you know anything about this?" the officer asked. Jack quickly explained what had happened, from hearing the cries to discovering the woman in the compactor. He told the officer about the blanket near the machine and his concerns about how she had ended up there. "We'll take it from here," the officer said, his voice firm. "We'll do a full investigation." Jack nodded, his mind still reeling from the shock of the morning. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's battered body, the faintest sign of life left in her. It was clear she had been through something terrible. As the police continued their investigation, Jack stood back, unsure of what to do next. He felt a strange mix of relief that the woman was getting the help she needed, but also anger at the thought of whoever had done this to her. He couldn't understand why someone would treat another person like that. The questions kept swirling in his mind. But for now, all he could do was wait. The morning had taken an unexpected turn, and Jack knew he would never forget it. His routine had been broken in the most shocking way, and the woman's cries would stay with him forever. Jack couldn't shake the images from that morning. The woman's face, pale and bruised, the weak hand reaching out from the pile of trash. It kept playing over and over in his mind. What had happened to her? Who could have done something so horrible? He was haunted by the unanswered questions and the desperate cries he had heard. Later that afternoon, Jack decided to take a walk to clear his head. He couldn't go back to work just yet. His usual route felt different now, the streets somehow quieter. The world outside seemed the same, but inside, Jack was still rattled. His thoughts were stuck on the woman. Who was she? What had happened to her? As he walked, he noticed the police had put up yellow tape around the area where the trash compactor was, marking it as part of the investigation. There were still a few officers standing guard, taking notes and asking neighbors if they had seen anything unusual. But no one had. The neighbors hadn't heard any noise, and no one had noticed anything strange. The day dragged on, and Jack couldn't get the image of the woman's face out of his head. She had been so vulnerable, so alone in that compactor. What had led her to that awful situation? Why hadn't anyone helped her sooner? That evening, Jack sat down at his kitchen table, his coffee cold and forgotten in front of him. His mind was spinning with thoughts. The police had told him that the woman was in the hospital, recovering, but they didn't have many answers yet. They didn't even know her name. The woman hadn't been able to tell them much. She was still too weak and confused when they found her. But the police had promised they would find out what happened. As Jack sat there, lost in thought, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. "Hello," Jack said, his voice tired. "Hi, is this Jack?" A woman's voice asked. It was gentle, but there was a hint of hesitation in it. "This is Jack. Who's this?" Jack replied, his curiosity piqued. "My name is Emily. I'm the woman who, well, you found me earlier today. I just wanted to thank you. I can't thank you enough for what you did." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." Emily's voice cracked slightly on the other end. "I don't even know how to explain what happened. It's all a blur." Jack's heart went out to her. "Take your time. Just know you're safe now. Do you remember anything? Maybe it could help." There was a long pause on the line before Emily spoke again, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I remember. A lot of pain. A lot of fear. But I don't know how I ended up there. I don't know who would do something like that to me." Jack's chest tightened. He wished he could say something that would make her feel better, but he couldn't. Instead, he just said, "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. Just focus on getting better." "I will," Emily replied, her voice stronger now. "I'm just so grateful you were there. You saved my life." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure how he'd saved her life, but hearing her words made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he had done something right. He stayed on the phone a little longer, talking with Emily, offering what little comfort he could. As they ended the call, Jack felt a small sense of peace. The woman was alive. She was safe. But he still had so many questions. The answers would come, he hoped. For now, all he could do was wait. The next morning, Jack woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. He was still groggy from sleep, his mind foggy, but the sudden sound of the phone pulled him awake. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was an unknown number. It could be someone from the police or another follow-up about the incident with the woman. He quickly answered the call, trying to shake off his sleepiness. "Hello," Jack said, his voice rough. "Jack, it's Emily," the woman's voice came through, soft but steady. Jack sat up straight in bed, his heart racing slightly. He had just spoken to her yesterday, but hearing her voice again brought back all the emotions from the day before. "Emily, how are you feeling?" he asked, genuinely concerned. "I'm doing better. The doctors say I'm recovering, but it's still a bit hard to believe I'm even here," she said, her voice sounding weary but filled with gratitude. "I'm glad you're okay." "Really glad," Jack replied, feeling a weight lift from his chest, just hearing that she was doing better. There was a short silence on the line, and then Emily spoke again, her tone more serious this time. "I need to talk to you. I don't remember much from what happened, but I think I know who put me there. I don't know if I should tell anyone yet, but I trust you." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Who put her there? The words hit him hard. He had suspected that someone must have been behind this, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean? Do you know who did this to you?" Jack asked, his voice urgent. "I'm not completely sure, but I think it might have been my husband, Sam." Emily's voice faltered, as if even saying the name caused her pain. I didn't want to believe it, Jack, but I can't shake the feeling that he's the one. I don't know how it happened, but it's all starting to make sense. Jack's stomach twisted at her words. He had assumed that this was some sort of tragic accident, but now he was hearing something much darker. Her husband. How could this be? But Emily's voice was filled with conviction. She seemed so sure of what she was saying, and Jack knew he had to help her piece it all together. I'm so sorry, Emily. That's horrible. But if you're sure, you need to tell the police. They can help you. Jack's voice was firm, though he felt his own confusion growing. Was this really happening? Could someone she loved be capable of such a thing? I'm scared, Jack, Emily said, her voice small now. I don't know what he might do if I go to the police. I'm afraid of what might happen next. Jack felt his heart ache for her. He could hear the fear in her voice, and he understood why she was scared. But she had to be strong, and she had to take control of her life back. You don't have to face this alone, Emily, Jack said gently. You've already taken the first step by talking about it. The police can protect you. I'll help you if you need anything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Emily finally spoke, her voice shaky but determined. I'll call them. I don't want to live in fear anymore. Thank you, Jack, for being there for me. Jack exhaled deeply, feeling the heavy weight settle on his chest. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to help Emily, no matter what. Whatever came next, he would stand by her side, and they would face it together. The next few days felt like a blur for Jack. He couldn't stop thinking about Emily and her revelation. The idea that her husband, Sam, could be responsible for what happened to her filled Jack's mind with doubt and fear. How could someone so close to her do something so cruel? Emily had gone to the police, just as Jack had suggested, but Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy. She had already been through so much, and now the truth was out in the open. Sam's actions, whatever they had been, would come to light. Emily was scared, and Jack couldn't blame her. The police were now investigating the situation, but there were still many unanswered questions. Emily had been too shaken to remember everything clearly, and Jack knew it would take time for her to recall the details. But one thing was certain. Emily's trust in Sam had been shattered, and she couldn't go back to him, not after everything she'd been through. Jack found himself visiting her at the hospital regularly. She was recovering physically, but emotionally, it was another story. Each time he saw her, he could see the sadness in her eyes. She had been through so much, and it was hard to see her struggle with the reality of what had happened to her. One afternoon, when Jack walked into her hospital room, Emily was sitting up in bed, looking out the window. She turned when she heard him enter, and gave him a small, weary smile. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," Jack replied, sitting in the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling today?" Emily shrugged, her eyes downcast. "I'm okay, I guess. Physically, I'm getting better. But emotionally, it's hard. I don't know what to think anymore." Jack nodded, understanding what she meant. The pain of betrayal was something he couldn't imagine. "It'll take time," he said gently. "But you're not alone in this. You've got people who care about you." Emily met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Jack. I don't know how I would have made it through all of this without you. You saved my life." Jack felt a lump in his throat at her words, but he didn't want her to feel like she was a burden. "I'm just glad you're okay," he said quietly. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. A police officer entered, holding a folder in his hands. Emily's face tightened when she saw him, her fear returning. Jack could feel the tension in the air, but he tried to stay calm. "Emily, we have some news," the officer said. "We've been talking to Sam, and we found some things that are concerning." Emily's heart raced at his words, and she clenched the sheets in her hands. "What do you mean?" "We're not sure yet, But it seems like Sam may have been hiding a lot from you. We found evidence that suggests he's been involved in some suspicious activities. We don't have all the details, but we're still investigating." Emily looked over at Jack, her face pale. He could see the mix of fear and relief in her eyes. She was afraid of what might happen, but she was also relieved that the truth was coming out. Jack took a deep breath, squeezing her hand gently. "Whatever happens, Emily, you're going to be okay. The truth is finally coming to light, and that's the first step toward healing." The officer nodded and left, giving them a moment alone. Emily looked at Jack, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Jack. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jack smiled softly, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that was happening. "You don't have to thank me. I'll always be here for you." They sat in silence for a moment, knowing that there was still a long road ahead of them. But for the first time in days, Emily seemed a little more at peace. The truth was coming out, and that was the first step toward a new beginning. The weeks that followed were full of ups and downs for Emily. She spent most of her time in the hospital, trying to heal both physically and emotionally. The news about her husband Sam had shocked everyone, including the police. They were investigating his actions further, and new details were beginning to emerge. Emily had a lot of questions, but she was determined to get through this, one step at a time. Jack continued to visit her every day, offering support and encouragement. As the days passed, Emily began to regain her strength. She was slowly starting to trust herself again, and Jack could see the change in her. The sadness in her eyes was still there, but there was also a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, after another visit from the police, Emily sat up in her hospital bed, her eyes focused on the window. Jack walked in, a fresh cup of tea in his hands. "You look like you're thinking about something," Jack said, setting the cup down on her bedside table. Emily smiled faintly. "I am. I've been thinking about what comes next." Jack took a seat next to her. "What do you mean?" Emily turned her gaze to him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been through so much, and I've learned a lot about myself, about what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not. I've been running from the truth for so long, and now I need to face it. I need to rebuild my life." Jack nodded, understanding her words. It was clear that Emily had grown stronger through everything she had endured. "You've been through more than most people ever will, Emily. You're already so strong, and you'll keep getting stronger." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Jack. You helped me find my strength. You never gave up on me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Jack smiled, feeling the warmth in his chest. "You did all the hard work. You took the first step, and that's the hardest part." The next few days brought more answers. The police had gathered enough evidence to arrest Sam for his actions. The details were still unclear, but Emily was beginning to find peace with the truth. She realized that she didn't need to know every detail to understand that what had happened wasn't her fault. One day, when Emily was finally able to leave the hospital, Jack drove her home. It was a quiet ride, but there was a sense of calm between them. Emily had made the decision to start fresh, to rebuild her life without the shadow of her past weighing her down. When they arrived at her house, Emily paused before stepping out of the car. She turned to Jack and smiled. "Thank you, Jack. I don't think I'll ever be able to fully repay you for everything you've done for me, but I promise I'll keep moving forward. I'm taking control of my life now." Jack smiled back, his heart full of pride. "You don't need to repay me. You've already done the hardest part." Emily took a deep breath, looking at her house for the first time with a new sense of hope. "It's a new beginning," she said softly. "A new chapter." Jack watched her as she walked toward her front door, knowing that Emily was going to be okay. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for it. She had survived the darkness, and now she was ready to embrace the light. As Jack drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Emily had come so far, and the future was hers to shape. The journey wasn't over, but it was a new beginning for both of them. Jack knew that whatever happened, they would always be there for each other. The bond they had formed in the darkest moments had become something unbreakable. And in the end, that was all that mattered.